So I have the opportunity to preach about the next generation. I kind of had to laugh when Pastor Kevin was like, you know what, we're going through all of our priorities. You're going to take next generation. I'm like, isn't that a little cliche to have the youth pastor talk about the next generation? But here we are, and I'm all right with that. So I want to get right into it, just kind of talking about what the next generation is and what our role is in it, and who the next generation is and what we need to be doing with that. So our priority simply says this when it comes to the next generation. We, being the Church of River Life, we will intentionally invest our time, money, prayer, and resources into making the next generation disciples of Jesus Christ. Now, there's some things that are in there that I do this with my youth on Wednesday, so you're going to get a little snapshot of what we do in youth. I always give a definition list because there's some things in there that we don't know what these things mean. So if we are going to make disciples of Jesus Christ, first we have to know what is a disciple. So there are two different terms that I want us to define quite simply. It is disciple and it is discipleship. Now, disciple means a student who has made a public declaration to follow the lifestyle of a particular teacher. If I am a disciple of Pastor Kevin, then I'm doing everything within my power to be exactly like Pastor Kevin. If there's somebody else that maybe you look up to, it's not just you follow the teachings of that person, you get so involved with what they do that basically if you put your life and their life side by side, there won't be any difference. That's what a disciple is. Not just a student, but someone who is fully engrossed in the lifestyle of that teacher. Now, then we look at the term for discipleship. Now, that is the verb of disciple, discipleship, which means the act of making a disciple. Now, the idea behind discipleship isn't that we're making disciples of ourselves, but that we make disciples of Christ. So, and I'll talk about this a little bit later, but you know you've been a successful disciple when your disciples are making disciples. I'll say that again. You will know that you've been a successful disciple when your disciples are making disciples. So let's get into this. What does discipleship actually look like? So there are three different, I just called them modes of discipleship. We need to model what discipleship is to the next generation. We need to mentor discipleship into the next generation, and we need to mobilize the next generation to make more disciples. What we'll be focusing on in each one of these is Joshua, looking at how Joshua and Moses modeled that idea of discipleship. We'll look at 1 Timothy and how Timothy and Paul showed that mentorship side of discipleship. And finally, we will see Matthew 10, where Jesus mobilizes the disciples to go do what he's called them to do. So let's pray, and then we'll get right into it. Father, I thank you. I thank you for this time and this opportunity to dive into your word and to dive into the things that you have called us to do, Lord. God, I pray that you would help me rightly handle what you have given me to preach this morning, and that everything that is said and done would be according to your word now. So God, I pray that you'd open our eyes to see you like we've never seen you before, open our ears to hear your voice clearly, and open our hearts to experience all that you want us to experience, God, so we can be what you have called us to be. It's in your name we pray. Amen. So discipleship is a lot easier said than done because it requires a consistent model of doing these things over and over and over. I've talked with multiple youth pastors just as I was starting up. I was like, all right, what do I need to know about youth pastoring? What do I need to actually figure out and be ready for? And one of the things that they talked about with youth ministry is you're not going to see the fruit for multiple years. And thinking back, that's kind of been a lot of my life, is that I'll plant seeds, I'll water, and then I don't see fruit. I don't see those things happening in those students, in those people, for a minimum of 5 years. There are students that I taught when they were sophomores in high school that are now freshmen in college that I'm only just starting to see the slightest sliver of fruit of what we talked about their sophomore year. That's a long time. So I don't want you to be discouraged. Okay, I'm failing as a disciple. I'm not making disciples. Let me tell you, it's just a long process. and that's okay. We got a long time. So I want to dive into really what it looks like to be a disciple. So I want to start just simply with Fine Arts 2017. So 2017 was my senior year of high school, and Twyla Kuntz was our current DYD, or our district youth director, and she was transitioning from her time as DYD into a more missional role. So this was her last sermon. It was the last time that she was going to be talking to the North Dakota State, and she had this sermon that was called "The One Word That Changes the World." And she went through this whole idea, and the one word is yes. She said, when you say yes to everything that God has planned for you, when you say yes to everything that God has called you to be, that is a radical word that will change the trajectory of your life. And I remember sitting there during the response, and I remember just kind of asking the Lord, I'm like, all right, what do I need to say yes to? And it simply was a picture, as if God was holding out a contract and like a really gigantic scroll. And it just kind of all flurled down, and at the very bottom was a line, and it said, your signature here. And I remember being kind of shocked by it, because I'm looking at it, and a majority of the contract was blank. And it was as if God was writing things in at the very beginning, but I really couldn't tell what he was writing, and there was a lot of blank page. Now, I don't know if you know anything about a contract, but if there's a blank contract, you probably shouldn't sign it, because then they can write whatever they want, and you've agreed to it, whether you think you've agreed to it or not. So I remember thinking about that. I'm like, Lord, you sure? Like, this is a lot of trust that you're asking me to have here. And I realized that if I was really going to say yes, I had to say yes not to just the things that I knew and that I was planning for, but I had to say yes to the blank margin. I had to say yes to the discipleship that God was leading me through so that I could be everything that he called me to be and trust that he was going to do all of those things. So I remember I picked up the metaphorical pen and I signed the paper and I said, all right, God, whatever you have planned. And then I went to Trinity and traveled the world and all kinds of things that I could have never imagined. And now I'm back here. If I would have planned that contract, I probably wouldn't have been here. Not that I don't like you guys. It's just simply, this was not my plan. But it was God's plan, and it was glorious. And I love that I get this chance. But I look back on some of those things when I was being discipled, and I failed. I failed a lot. I look back when I was in Wilson, I was a teacher at a Bible college, or at a Bible school, and I was going to a different church. It was a non-denominational church, and it was a good church, but I remember there was one point I stopped going because, I don't know if you've used this, I use this phrase, and I hate it. I stopped going because I wasn't being fed. Anybody ever used that phrase before? So, that was a failure on my part. I realized, whoops. There was another time that in Williston, I had isolated myself. Again, I wasn't being fed at this church, so I really didn't build connection with this church. And the school, as great as it was, there weren't a lot of people my age that I was working with. So I isolated myself to the point of depression. I was saying, you know what? It's a lot easier. I don't have to build relationships. I don't have to go and find these people. I don't have to spend time with these people. I can do it on my own. That was a mistake. When I went to Ellendale to get my master's, I knew that God had called me to get my master's, but I didn't know what else there was for me work-wise, because I still needed to eat, I still needed to pay rent, so I was working at this tech company, and I got really bored with it real quickly, because it was the same thing, day in and day out. So I started pursuing different things in that company, and I became really prideful in what I was doing, because I knew better about tech than all these other people. Let me clue you in, I have no idea. If you ask me about Bitcoin or anything else that we did there, still have no idea. I was working there and I had no idea what was going on. But I became prideful in that. I said, no, I know exactly what's going on. No idea. I became actively engaged. I had a supervisor that I was actively engaged in dissension against. We as a crew were working towards getting him either fired or replaced. And there were some things, there was incompetence, whatever, but the way that we approached it was not the correct way. And that was a failure on my part. Now, you may be asking, why are you covering all of these things? Because when it comes to discipleship, failure is a must. Because it was in these moments that I realized what God was actually doing in my life. These were moments that I failed. I hated it. I look back on those moments, I'm like, wow, that sucks. That was not what I was supposed to be doing. That was not what I was called to do. But I look back on it now, and I look, when I was in Williston, I was convicted so strongly my second year that I wasn't going to this church, that I had to find another church, not to be fed, but to feed. I wasn't the pastor, I wasn't leading anything, but I went there simply to be connected with the people. Sometimes there are moments on a Sunday morning or a Wednesday night where you need to be fed, but don't forget that you also get to feed. Everyone here is called to be a disciple and a discipler, or makers of disciples, which means sometimes we feed, and sometimes we feed even when we don't want to feed the person. I'll just let that sit with you. Another point in Williston, I was humbled significantly when I became the hospital chaplain. Because I knew what I was doing, right? I know this. I've been, like, if you didn't know, Pastor Kevin is my dad. I have been in ministry or around ministry my entire life. So I became a hospital chaplain, like, yeah, I know what I'm doing. I know exactly all the things that need to happen. I know the right words. And then there was a random Tuesday night where 3 teenagers came into the emergency room and 2 of them died. And I know what I need to say to these parents who just their entire life changed. I have no idea what to say in those moments. And I was humbled in those moments, being like, God, I need you in this moment because there is no way that I know what to do here. I can't do this. When I was in Ellendale with that leader, God started putting leaders in my life that corrected that. And that was a hard point. Because these were leaders that I trusted, leaders that I've known for a while. He's still the pastor in Ellendale. His name is also Pastor Kevin, which I find hilarious. But Pastor Kevin down in Ellendale, he provided some of those correction moments because he had that relationship with me. And he's like, Mark, that was stupid. And if you know Pastor Kevin Libby, he says those very blunt things, just like, stop. You're being an idiot right now. It was great. It was exactly the leader that I needed. And he humbled me in those moments because God had put him in place to be in, so I was in discipleship with Kevin. Not so that I could become more like Kevin Libby, but so that I could become more like Christ. So failure is a must in the pathway of discipleship. Because there are going to be people that you pour into, there are going to be people that pour into you that fail. They may be trying to pour into you, and it is just not what you're needing in that season. It might be later, but maybe not that season. There are going to be people that you pour into that maybe you don't actually see any fruit for years to come. And maybe at some point, there's fruit, but you never see it. So it may feel like failure. But failure is a must on the pathway to discipleship because failure is not the end. Failure is the beginning to something great. When we look at Exodus, we see Moses and Joshua. Now, Moses was the start. He was one of the greatest people in Israelite history, and he has led the people now from Egypt, from slavery of 400 years, into the Promised Land. And he models exactly what discipleship looked like. It says this in Exodus 33:11. The Lord would speak to Moses face to face, as one speaks to a friend. Then Moses would return to the camp, but his young aide, Joshua, the son of Nun, did not leave the tent. So let me fill you in on a little bit of backstory here. Moses, being that person, you would expect he's the one that's going to lead the charge into the Promised Land and take over the land that God has promised. But Moses failed. There was a moment that God had told Moses that you need to speak to the rocks and water will flow and then the thirsty people of Israel will be filled. And instead of speaking to the rock, he struck the rock. Now, we don't have time to go into all of that, but that was an egregious sin against the Lord. And he said, Moses, you're not going to enter into the Promised Land. Joshua will be the leader of this team. Joshua will be the leader of bringing about everything that you've been building up to. So if you stop with just Moses, he failed. He didn't make it to the promised land. He just wandered around the desert for 40 years, and that was it. But if you look at it as the long line of discipleship, Moses did something right here. Because as he modeled what it was like to have a relationship with God, he modeled it so well that when the next generation saw him doing it, they said, I want that, but I want it even greater than what he has. And we see that. In his young age, Joshua did not leave the tent. Even when Moses was done praying, even when he was done talking with the Lord, he left the tent and Joshua stayed. He said, this is important to me. So we got to look at that in the idea that we are in charge of the next generation, whether we have kids or not. There's a story that I use with our youth all the time, and it's our hospitality story. So there's a picture that comes up, and every single Wednesday we talk about this. Any of our youth in the room, what is our phrase for this one? Think like an owner. So I'm going to tell you the story of our hospitality. And youth, it's going to be a little bit different. I'm sorry. So there is, well, we'll call this lady Linda. Linda has moved to a new city, and she is hired on at this coffee shop. And she decides, all right, this is a good coffee shop. I like this coffee shop. And she's working with the owner. And she's constantly talking with the owner, constantly under the supervision of the owner. And then she starts to realize a couple of things that are different about this owner than any other boss that she's ever had. And as they're making coffee and whatnot, the owner would pick up a rag and wipe down the counters. Even though they didn't really need to be wiped down, it was still kind of okay. Anytime that there's a napkin or a cup that was sitting on the ground, the owner would be the first to go and pick it up, and she would be the first one to make sure that everything in the coffee shop was okay. So Linda went to the coffee shop owner one day, and she said, all right, listen, I get it, I understand this is your coffee shop, but really, there's somebody else that'll take care of it. They can take care of those things. Why do you as the owner have to pick up the napkins? Why do you as the owner have to wipe down the counters? And the owner looked at Linda and she said, I am they. She says, Linda, I don't know what you mean. What do you mean I am they? She said, if they need to take care of it, that means I need to take care of it. This is my coffee shop. This is what I've been given and called to do. This is mine, and I need to take care of it. I am they. When we say they'll take care of it, someone else will go be a youth leader. Someone else will help out with kids. Discipleship calls us to a really uncomfortable truth, that someone else is you. Because we cannot do this on our own. So how we model the lifestyle of Jesus to the next generation is being involved with the next generation. There was a point, I think it was last week, we had the altar, which is our time of prayer. And because I'm a numbers guy, I love just kind of keeping track of all those things. I noticed, and I want to call out these parents because they did a really good job with their kids. Out of all of the people that were there, about a third of our people that were at the altar were next gen. They were youth and they were kids. And the crazy thing about it was, their parents weren't even there. Now that's not a bash on the parents. That's actually pretty cool. That they're willing to be at the altar. They're willing to be in prayer, even though their parents have left the tent. They are the ones that are now involved. They are the ones that are pursuing everything that God has for them. And it has been, I was shocked by how easy it was to become a youth pastor here. Because our youth students and our kids are so heavily involved in everything that's happening. Not because they have to be, but because they want to be. And because God has called them into these places. So, and this is a shameless plug too. Get involved in one of our next-gen ministries, whatever that might be. Maybe that is bringing your kids to a life group. Because when you model healthy relationship, your kids see that healthy relationship, and then they replicate those relationships. When you're involved on our Wednesday nights, when you're involved on our Sunday mornings with kids, you're pouring into the next generation. I didn't put it in here, but Joshua failed the next generation. Moses was successful. He said, all right, Joshua, you keep going, you keep doing this. And Joshua did. And he goes through the entire Holy Land, and he takes over, and they take it over as the Israelites. And so long as Joshua and that generation lived, the Israelites followed the Lord. But as soon as Joshua and his generation died, the next generation immediately turned and went back to their old ways of following different gods. Moses succeeded in discipling the next generation even when he failed. Joshua succeeded in his own time, but failed to pass on the full plot of what God is planning for us. So we have to understand that if we're not involved, we may do great things in our life, but in comparison to what God has planned, that is a very short time. So where are we being involved in discipling? So that is modeling. The next one I want to hit is mentoring. When you mentor the next generation, you are bringing them alongside so that they can see what you're doing. And not just, okay, sit here, watch, but then give them the opportunity to. This is a lot of what Paul and Timothy did. In 1 Timothy, we see that Paul has built this relationship with Timothy. The first time that we see Timothy is in Acts 16. And he was in a church in the district of Greece, and he is really highly spoken of by the churches in Greece. So Paul says, all right, you're going to join the team. And he comes alongside Paul, and he's with Paul. Scholars say that he's with Paul a minimum of 3 to 4 years. 3 to 4 years of just being with Paul, of learning from Paul. Now, there's a little bit of artistic license I would take, because we don't have the conversations between Paul and Timothy. That's the only real conversation that we have, is that he joins him to the team, and that's it. But when he's walking with Paul, he's learning from Paul. He's learning how Paul prays. He's learning how Paul is acting. He's learning how Paul is building his relationship with the Lord. And because he has the relationship with him, he can ask Paul all of these kinds of questions. Now, can you imagine just sitting underneath Paul and just being like, all right, Paul, what do you mean by a thorn in your flesh? This is still not making sense to me. Like, what do you mean by this? What do you mean by this? What do you mean by this? Another one of our culture words that I'm not going to hit on real hard, but it's questions in youth group. Because when we start to ask questions, we start to grow in all of those things. So we take a little bit of artistic license and assume that Timothy asked a lot of questions. Now, 3.5 years, 4 years, that's a lot of questions. If some of you have teenagers or kids, I've heard that they ask a lot of questions. Is that true? Right? Okay, imagine that, but dedicated to a specific thing for 4 years. That's a lot of questions. So many questions, in fact, that when we get to 1 Timothy, Timothy is put on an island, and Paul says, you're in charge. Not in charge of this church or that church. You're in charge of every single church on this island. So he was, the term that we'd use is a bishop. That he wasn't just the pastor, he was in charge of everything. That's what mentorship is. It is intentional relationship that builds into them now going. And that leads us right into our third point, mobilization. Now that is simply, we go from this place to that place. But we've talked about that. There's only so many things that we can do in our lifetime. So when we get to the end of our life, how do we continue to mobilize into the next generation? It's by making sure that they are ready and able to do what they've been called to do. Now, I've had students many times when I talk about this, they're like, well, Mark, how do I reach my school? How do I reach my workplace? How do I reach my family? How do I reach my community? How am I supposed to do all of these things? And I talk about the biggest word or the biggest number in the world. And I ask them, I'm like, all right, what do you think? What is the biggest number in the world? They're like, infinity. And I'm like, well, that's a cop-out. No. That's not it. What is the biggest number in the world? I'm like, I don't know, Mark. What do you think? And I say, the biggest number is just one more. You don't have to reach your community, but you can start by reaching the barista that you talk to every morning. You don't have to reach your family, and in my case, that's a really big, I was looking at numbers, I think it's like 121 people in my extended family, and probably more. I can't reach 121 people, but what I can do is I can build my relationship with my uncle who likes to fish. I don't like fishing, but he does. And I like my uncle, so I like fishing. As simple as that. I don't have to start with the workplace. Those are some big places. But I can start with the coworker that I get lunch with every day. I don't have to start with my school. I start with my friend that I'm going to be consistently in math class with every single day for this entire semester. Because just one more isn't a place, it isn't even a people group, it's a person. And discipleship is all about that relationship. Discipleship leads to relationship, which leads to them being followers of Jesus. To think big, we have to start by thinking small. There's a youth pastor in our state who had a couple of students, 2 girls, and they decided, you know what? We're going to start a Bible study because we feel like we're called to lead a Bible study. So they were leading a Bible study at their school, and to start off with, it was them and a bunch of socially awkward dudes, a total of 5 of them, I believe. And that was it. There's 5 of them. But because they were consistently meeting every week, that group of 5 has now turned into a group of 70 or more. Not because they were trying to reach 70, not even because they were trying to reach their school, but because they had relationship with each other and relationship with God, and they said, this is important enough that we are going to be consistent in what we are doing. So to think big, to reach those 70 people, to reach your coworkers, to reach your workplace, you think small. You start small. When we think about this, we talk a lot in leadership group about capacity. What is my capacity? Is that there are certain things that I can do, and then I really can't do anymore. I was listening to a podcast by Greg Kershell, and he talked about capacity. Do you know how you grow your capacity? You go over your capacity. I am by nature an introvert, which means that when I'm around people, I love being around people, but they exhaust me, which means I need time alone so that I can then get more energy and then I can go out and be with people again. When I was teaching in Williston, I was going from being with students from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. or 5 p.m., depending on the day. And then I was going to different life groups. I was in church. I was exhausted all the time. But my capacity grew. It wasn't fun, to say the least, but it was exactly what I needed so that my capacity could grow. Now, there is a balance between burnout and building your capacity. We don't have time to get into that. But your capacity is not set in stone. And the reason that I mention capacity is because maybe adding in a Wednesday night or a life group or going to kids' church, that might be beyond your capacity. And that's okay. Because you are not called to be stagnant, you are called to grow. Your capacity grows when you move in faith that Jesus is going to do what he's called you to do. You may be sitting there terrified out of your mind about being in kids' church because that's a lot that's going on. I don't know how to connect with the kids, but you know deep down that God has called you to be in our kids' ministry. Are you going to stay where you're at because your capacity is comfortable, or are you going to go and do what God has called you to do? the long-term goal may not be anything that we see. I think back on it, and I think back to when I first started talking with Justin, which was a while ago. Never in a million years did I think that he'd be one of our worship leaders, because he was 4 at the time. But through consistency in building relationship with him, we're now at this point. And I hope we're at a good point. Yeah? All right, cool. He's now one of my youth students. He's one of my youth leaders. Not because I came back and I was like, all right, Justin, you're it. But because there was relationship that was built over time. And one of the beauties of the modern age that we live in, how many of you have a phone? There are students that I text pretty consistently that are not, quote, my students. And there are some who have graduated. I have a lot of students now who have graduated and are now in college. And now that mentorship, that modeling, it has changed. I'm no longer as heavily involved in the discipleship process with them, but that doesn't mean that I'm not discipling with them. Discipleship is a continual, constant act. It is not a big event, though they help. It is not a pastor standing on a stage telling you what to do, though I hope it helps. It is you changing a lifestyle slowly but surely to follow after what Jesus has called you to be. So I want to ask a very simple question. Are you a disciple? Are you a disciple? Now again, a disciple is one who dedicates their lifestyle to the teacher. If you're following the teachings, but not following the lifestyle, there's a word in the Bible for that. You're a Pharisee. You are a religious person. You may be a moral person. You may be good. But are you actually a disciple? When I think about our church, when I think about my youth group, when I think about the people in Devil's Lake, I don't want them to be good people. I want them to be disciples of Christ. Which is why we have moved in these last couple of years to doing life to life. Why we have done shifting evangelism. Because it's not about the event. It's not about all of these things that the church is doing. It's about the relationship that you are building with those around you. So I'm going to ask that you stand. And the thing that we're going to end with is prayer for the next generation. Now, maybe you are at a point and you are heavily convicted right now. Conviction leads to relationship. Condemnation leads you away from relationship. So if you're feeling convicted and you're like, wow, I really need to go and talk to someone, that's good. It's uncomfortable, but it's good. Now, if you leave this place and you're like, no, that didn't affect me at all, I'm going to keep doing the things that I've been doing, that might be condemnation. You might need to check yourself. I can't do it for you. So as we move into this time of prayer, and Pastor Kevin will come up and give a little bit more instruction on that. But I want us to start by praying for the next generation. Let's put up the slide of model, mentor, and mobilize. Yeah, that one. So I'm going to pray, and then we're going to take some time. I want you to just be praying for the students that you know, for the people that you know. Because next generation isn't always the minors, somebody that's under 18. It might be somebody who's just first come to faith. They are the next generation of believers. And they have no idea what's going on, except for what you provide them in the relationship and discipleship that you give them. So as I pray, I want you to be thinking about those people. And maybe they are under 18. That's okay. But who are you discipling? Because that is what makes you a disciple. A disciple is someone who multiplies disciples. So let's pray. God, I thank you that you are all powerful and all knowing and all loving. God, you have not called us to sit in place, but you have called us to grow. And as we grow, God, we understand that we cannot grow by ourselves. So God, I lift up the next generation to you in this moment. God, whether that be our under 18s or our first ever converts who are just coming to know you, God, I pray that you would be with this next generation. God, that even as we prepare to mentor, to model, and to mobilize, God, I pray that you'd start to give us dreams and visions of how that might be accomplished. God, whether we be coaching, or we be teaching, or in a life group, or on Wednesday nights, Lord. God, you are in charge and you are above it all. So God, I pray that you would disturb us towards discipleship. Disturb us when we are too well pleased with where we are at. That we have become so comfortable, Lord, that we have forgotten that you have called us to great and mighty things. God, even as we go out upon the waves that are terrifying to us, as we go into the storms, God, we realize that you are there. So God, reveal to us now how we are to reach this next generation. Not by reaching the entirety of the population of Devil's Lake or an entire school system, but God, who is that one? God, give me just one more. Just one more that needs discipleship. Just one more that needs relationship with you. Just one more. Not for our glory, Lord, but for your glory. God, lead us into all things and all truth. Open our eyes to see you. Open our ears to hear your voice clearly. And open our hearts to experience all you want us to experience, God. Not for our own sakes, but for the sake of the next generation and for the sake of the world that you have called us to.